For many centuries in a row, the plague regularly mowed down European cities, destroying millions of people. Where did the most terrible disease of modern times come from? How did you fight with her? How did people behave when faced with the inexorability of death? And how did the pestilence manage to win?
3, 2, 1!
Among the many infectious diseases that have been mowing down humanity for thousands of years, the plague has always occupied a special place. It struck the imagination with its deadly power and was perceived as the punishment of the gods or God. For Europeans who lived in the XV centuries, regular outbreaks of the plague were a frightening daily occurrence, and the history of the Old World cannot be understood if you forget about this dangerous guest. The plague, of course, is not the only mass murderer in history. For several thousand years of the existence of urban civilizations, humanity has faced many epidemics. He was affected by smallpox, measles, syphilis, cholera, typhus, influenza, Spanish and other varieties. Some of these diseases devastated entire regions, led to the decline of states or the disappearance of ethnic groups. In 1778, the English captain James Cook discovered Hawaiian Islands. For 70 years after the appearance of Europeans, the population of the archipelago has decreased from about 500,000 people to about 80,000. In addition, there have been many types of pestilence in the past who wished to remain incognito. Their descriptions in oral traditions, historical chronicles and ancient medical treatises are often too conventional and vague. Therefore, historians and doctors in many cases can only guess which pathogen caused this or that epidemic. For example, English sweat Pseudomonas anglicus, English sweat, which affected the British Isles several times from the end of the XV to the middle of the XV century. In a long series of epidemics, the plague still stood apart. She was perceived as an absolute disease, the very personification of pestilence. Its name in Latin is pestis. This word meant scourge, disaster, doom. The English name plague has similar roots. It comes from the Latin word plaga, blow, wound, disaster. These names testify to the horror that caused the pestilence, from which there was no hiding. Microorganisms that cause infectious diseases actively enjoy the benefits of civilization. Most large-scale epidemics need a crowding of victims, and they are born together with large cities and intense human flows. Thanks to the trade routes that connected the Far East with the Mediterranean back in the era of the Roman Empire, the plague from Central Asia passed through Eurasia at least 3 times in history, claiming millions of victims. Although these waves have never reached the population of the whole world, they are commonly called pandemics. The first pandemic, which began in Central Asia in the middle of the V century, during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, reached Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Pestilence spread throughout the Mediterranean, North Africa and other lands. Outbreaks of the plague continued until the middle of the VE century. The number of victims of the Justinian plague is estimated at 30-50 million people, but we must understand that statistics for such distant times are unreliable and conditional. Then the plague subsided for a long time and struck again in the middle of the XV century. The second pandemic, which was later dubbed the Black Death, apparently began in the 1330s in China. Along the Great Silk Road, the bacilli got to the Genoese port of Kaffa in the Crimea, and from there they reached Sicily with merchant ships in 1347. Having broken out in the south of Italy, the plague in 1348-1352 swept across Europe, up to England, Scandinavia and distant Russian principalities. According to historians, it mowed down up to a third of Europeans. Some where the proportion of victims was much less, and some areas and cities were simply depopulated. The population of England probably halved, and it took 250 years to return to the level of 1348. According to various estimates, the number of victims worldwide ranged from 50 to 200 million people. Merchant and chronicler of his native Florence Giovanni Villanici, 1276 or 1280, 1348, in the New Chronicle, having reached his own days, began to describe the terrible pestilence that recently struck the city. Not knowing when it would end, he left a dash in the manuscript. The plague lasted until, however, he did not put down the date. The plague mowed down Villani along with tens of thousands of other Florentines. Having dealt a powerful blow to Europe, the plague did not leave it and continued to return periodically until the XV century. Seville in 1649–1650 lost about half of its 120,000 inhabitants. Naples in 1656 more than half of its 450,000. In the west, the last major outbreak occurred in 1720 in Marseille. The disease was brought there by a ship from Syria. The pestilence spread throughout the south of France and by 1722 had killed more than 140,000 people. In 1771, the plague broke out in Moscow, and in 1778 in Istanbul. On the territory of the Ottoman Empire, outbreaks continued until the end of the 6th century. The third pandemic began in China in the middle of the 6th century and died out only in the 1920s. From Asia the plague with ship rats penetrated to India, then to the ports of North and South America, to the east and west coasts of Africa and to many coastal areas of Southeast Asia. In total the number of its victims is estimated at about 12 million people. For comparison, the Spanish flu epidemic, which raged around the world in 1918–1920, claimed about 50 million. Causes and perpetrators. The plague has always been intimidating in its egalitarianism. It smashed old and young, rich and poor, destroyed the usual social hierarchies. And I always left two main questions: what causes it and how to protect yourself from it. In the late Middle Ages and early modern times, when the plague returned to Europe over and over again, there were several main theories at the disposal of doctors, clerics and ordinary people, which were easily combined and integrated into each other. For thousands of years, people have considered epidemics to be a manifestation of the wrath of the gods or the one God. The Church taught that the Black Death and its subsequent outbreaks are the punishment that the Lord sends for the sins of entire cities and kingdoms. The plague, like a hail of invisible arrows, indiscriminately strikes the sinful and the righteous, because it is a collective punishment. To stop God's wrath, it is pointless to rely on medicines, doctors and any human tricks. Clerics tirelessly reminded that spiritual medicines are required here. Universal repentance, mass prayer services, processions and intercession of saints. In Catholic lens, Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch were considered the main protectors from the plague. Saint Sebastian is an early Christian martyr who lived in the IE century. According to legend, the Emperor Diocletian ordered him to be shot with bows. In thousands of images we see a young man tied to a tree or column and pierced with a cloud of arrows. But he did not die, was saved and later accepted martyrdom. In both Greco-Roman and Hebrew texts, the plague, like other diseases, was often described using the metaphor of arrows that fall from heaven on people. Apparently, this is why Saint Sebastian, who survived the execution, turned into a patron saint from this pestilence in the Middle Ages. Unlike Sebastian, Saint Roch was directly related to the plague. According to legend, he was born in Montpellier at the end of the ZE century. Going on a pilgrimage to Rome, he caught the plague and took refuge in a forest hut. The hunting dog of the local lord began to bring him food from the owner's table. Roh recovered, returned to France, but his relatives did not recognize him. He was thrown into prison as a spy and died there. As a sign of his holiness, the camera lit up with light, and next to the body an angel wrote in Latin, "Eris in pest patronus," you will be a defender against the plague. In most of the images, this saint, reminding of his specialization, points to the bubo that appeared on his leg. From the ZIV to the ZV century, doctors most often claimed that the plague was caused by the air, which became deadly due to the harmful influence of stars and comets, or because of poisonous miasma rising from the depths of the earth, from unburied corpses or rotting garbage. Therefore, to protect against the disease, purification of the atmosphere or strong odors that can kill the plague poison are required. Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron described the behavior of the Florentines during the plague of 1348. According to him, some of them walked around the city, holding in their hands some flowers, some fragrant herbs, some other fragrant substance, which they often smelled, believing it useful to refresh the brain with such aromas because the air seemed infected and fetid from the smell of corpses, patients and medicines. In the ZV centuries, one of the main symbols of the plague was the plague doctor. Doctors in strange masks with a long beak, similar to a bird, inspected the streets of infected cities. This costume was invented in 1619 by the French physician Charles Delorme. It included a raincoat made of leather or wax-soaked cloth, a cane with which a doctor could examine patients without touching them, and a mask with glazed eye holes and a long beak. It was a kind of gas mask, which was stuffed with aromatic substances, dried flowers and fragrant herbs, designed to protect against plague fumes. Natural, scientific and medical theories concerning the plague were easily combined with theological ones. For example, it could be said that the angry Lord, the cause of causes, uses the power of heavenly bodies poisoning the air, secondary causes, as an instrument of his justice. Bibliothèque Royale de Belgique. Fear made them look for scapegoats. Periodically there were rumors that the plague was deliberately spread by Jews, lepers, sorcerers, vagabonds, beggars, foreigners and other dangerous elements that should be caught and neutralized. Despite the regular warnings of the church authorities, in many places after the arrival of the Black Death, distraught residents accused Jews of poisoning wells. Pogroms broke out. However, the culprits of the epidemic were declared not only foreigners and Gentiles. In 1530, a poison plot was uncovered in Geneva, in which the head of the plague hospital, his wife, a local surgeon and even a chaplain allegedly consisted. Under torture they confessed that they had given themselves into the power of the devil, and he taught them how to cook a deadly potion. 15 years later, the Geneva authorities executed 39 poisoners on the same charge. During the Milan plague of 1630, women accused the Barbergian Giacomo Mora and the Commissioner of Public Health, Guglielmo Piazza, of deliberately sowing pestilence by smearing the walls of houses with plague potions. Both were executed. The real culprit of the epidemic is a rod-shaped bacterium, Bacillus, which was named Yersinia pestis. Man is just a random victim, periodically turning up to her on the fronts of the evolutionary struggle for survival. In some foci, the bacterium slumbers among its natural hosts, rodents, and only infects humans from time to time. Even the ancient Romans suspected that the plague was spread by cattle invisible to the eye. The Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro, in his treatise on contagion, contagious diseases and treatment 1546, suggested that diseases that are now called infectious can be carried by some tiny seeds. However, it was impossible to prove this without a microscope and other achievements of modern science. The bacterium that causes the plague was discovered in 1894 during an outbreak in Hong Kong. Swiss and French bacteriologist Alexander Yersin and Japanese Dr. Kitasato Shibasaburo independently found the culprit of a terrible disease in the tissues of patients. Already in 1897, bacteriologist and epidemiologist Vladimir Valdemar Kavkin, a native of Odessa, who emigrated to Europe in his youth, created the first anti-plague vaccine during the epidemic in British India. In nature, the plague bacterium lives in the organisms of animals, primarily rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, mice, rats. Only sometimes through flea bites, although there are other ways it is transmitted to humans. In medieval Europe, black rats were the main distributor of the epidemic. In wild animals, the symptoms of the disease are quite weak. Domestic mice and rats are much more susceptible to it, and a person is practically defenseless at all. The mechanism of plague infection is ingeniously simple and frighteningly effective. When a flea bites a sick animal, bacilli enter its body. They begin to multiply intensively and eventually clog the passage of the flea from the esophagus into the stomach. The blood that it feeds on cannot get there. The flea feels hungry all the time and, in order to get enough, attacks more and more victims. When bitten, she, trying to get rid of the bacterial plug, regurgitates a clot of bacteria into the wound, bringing a whole army of deadly Yersinia into the blood of the bitten animal or person. Depending on the method of infection and the development of the disease, the same bacterium causes several forms of plague. The most common of them is bubonic. Once in the blood, the bacillus penetrates into the lymph nodes and begins to multiply there at a gigantic speed. The nodes swell, harden and turn into a painful bubo. Its dangerous contents infect the circulatory system, and a person, if not using modern therapy, is likely to die from general intoxication. In the summer of 1665, the epidemic reached its peak. Newspapers published weekly reports on the number of deaths, bills of mortality. And the numbers grew at an alarming rate. 1,000, then 2, by September, 7,000 a week. The cemeteries at the churches were overflowing and the victims of the pestilence were hastily dumped into common ditches. In an attempt to stop the epidemic, the Lord Mayor ordered the destruction of dogs and cats, which, it was believed, could spread the infection. However, the effect of this measure was exactly the opposite of what was intended, because cats destroyed rats on which infected fleas traveled. If, as was believed, the infection is carried through the air, you need to protect yourself with a mixture of pungent odors and incense. Bonfires were ordered to be lit at street intersections. Rich Londoners burned sulfur, frankincense, hops. The poor are old shoes. The authorities recommended and in some places even prescribed smoking tobacco. However, the main and only effective measure was still the isolation of the sick or the self-isolation of those who are still healthy. Therefore, since ancient times, during epidemics, cities were closed, and barriers were put up in the way of strangers. In 1377, measures were introduced in the port of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, on the Adriatic Sea to protect the city from the plague. All ships arriving from infected or potentially contagious places had to wait 30 days before their crew was allowed to disembark. This period of isolation was called Trentina, from the Italian word trenta, 30. For those who arrived in the city by land, this period was 40 days. Hence the word quarantine. In the future, such measures have extended to other ports. In 1423, a special quarantine station was created on an island near Venice itself. There is an isolation hospital for suspicious visitors and plague patients. Since the Church of St. Mary of Nazareth has long been located on the island and St. Lazarus was considered one of the heavenly defenders of the plague, this place became known as Lazzaretto. Hence the familiar word infirmary. Individual houses, streets or blocks were isolated inside cities. In London, houses where there were plague victims were locked and boarded up from the outside. To prevent the sick from running away and multiplying the infection, sentries were posted at the doors. However, residents regularly tried to deceive them and get out of forced imprisonment. Today I was sad to find 2 or 3 houses in Drury Lane with a red cross on the doors and the inscription, "God have mercy on us," which was a very sad sight for me, because I had never seen anything like it before, if my memory serves me right. Immediately he began to sniff at himself and had to buy tobacco, which he began to sniff and chew until the foreboding disappeared. Samuel Pepys, Diary, June 7, 1665. I went out for a short walk, to be honest, to show off in my new doublet, and on the way back I noticed that the door of the house of the unfortunate Dr. Burnett was boarded up. I heard a rumor that he won the favor of the neighbors, because he discovered his illness and locked himself up of his own free will, thereby doing a wonderful deed. June 11, 1665. Today ends this sad month, sad, because the plague has already spread almost throughout the kingdom. Every day brings more and more sad news. 7,496 people died in the city this week, 6,102 of them from the plague. I am afraid, however, that the true death toll this week is approaching 10,000, partly because of the poor, who are dying in such numbers that it is impossible to count the number of the dead, and partly because of Quakers and others who do not want the bell to ring for them. On August 31, 1665, desperation made people grab at any straw. Londoners began to buy amulets against the plague infection. Miracle doctors multiplied everywhere, promising the most effective remedies that could protect against a deadly disease and cure those who were already ill. Flawless protective pills against the plague, the best strengthening remedy against unhealthy air, an incomparable medicine against the plague that had never been used before, the only effective healing water, the royal antidote to any diseases. I got up and put on a colored silk doublet, a beautiful thing, as well as a new curled wig. I bought it a long time ago, but I didn't dare to wear it, because when I bought it the plague was raging in Westminster. I wonder what the fashion for wigs will be when the plague ends, because now no one buys them for fear of getting infected. There are rumors that the hair of the deceased who died of the plague was used to make wigs. On September 3, 1665. God, how deserted and dreary the streets are, how many poor sick people are everywhere, all in scabs. How many sad stories I heard along the way, only talk. This one is dead, this one is sick, so many dead here, so many there. They say there is not a single doctor and only one pharmacist left in Westminster. Everyone has died. There is, however, hope that this week the disease will subside. God grant it. October 16, 1665. In the late autumn of 1665, the epidemic began to decline. In February 1666, King Charles returned to London. However, the city was soon waiting for another blow. After the Great Plague came the Great Fire. On September 2, a fire broke out in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Padding Lane, which quickly spread and devoured the city of London. More than 13,000 houses, 87 churches and St. Paul's Cathedral. After the fire, the city was reconstructed, increasing the width of the streets so that it would be more difficult for the infection to spread during the next plague. Desperation made people grab at any straw. Londoners began to buy amulets against the plague infection. Miracle doctors multiplied everywhere, promising the most effective remedies that could protect against a deadly disease and cure those who were already ill. Flawless protective pills against the plague, the best strengthening remedy against unhealthy air, an incomparable medicine against the plague that had never been used before, the only effective healing water, the royal antidote to any diseases. I got up and put on a colored silk doublet, a beautiful thing, as well as a new curled wig. I bought it a long time ago, but I didn't dare to wear it, because when I bought it the plague was raging in Westminster. I wonder what the fashion for wigs will be when the plague ends, because now no one buys them for fear of getting infected. There are rumors that the hair of the deceased who died of the plague was used to make wigs. Samuel Pepys, Diary, on September 3, 1665. God, how deserted and dreary the streets are, how many poor sick people are everywhere, all in scabs. How many sad stories I heard along the way, only talk. This one is dead, this one is sick, so many dead here, so many there. They say there is not a single doctor and only one pharmacist left in Westminster. Everyone has died. There is, however, hope that this week the disease will subside. God grant it. October 16, 1665. In the late autumn of 1665, the epidemic began to decline. In February 1666, King Charles returned to London. However, the city was soon waiting for another blow. After the Great Plague came the Great Fire. On September 2, a fire broke out in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Padding Lane, which quickly spread and devoured the city of London. More than 13,000 houses, 87 churches and St. Paul's Cathedral. After the fire the city was reconstructed, increasing the width of the streets so that it would be more difficult for the infection to spread during the next plague. I am with Lord Bruckner and Mrs. Williams in a carriage drawn by 4 horses to London, to my master's house in Covent Garden. God, what a sensation the carriage entering the city made. The gatekeepers bow low, beggars come running from all sides. What a joy to see that the streets are full of people again, that shops are starting to open, although in many places, in 7 or 8 everything is still boarded up, and yet the city has come to life compared to what it was. January 5, 1666. According to the well-known formula attributed to Napoleon, every French soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack. But dangerous microorganisms were often hidden in the same satchel, which together with armies and their wagons, overcame enormous distances. Up until the Second World War the most mass murderers during armed conflicts were not arrows, bullets and nuclei, but microbes. The war was closely followed by its eternal companions, famine and pestilence. The roads were filled with crowds of soldiers, refugees and merchants who carried diseases like a postman, letters. In 1627–1628, during the campaign to pacify the Protestants, the 8,000th Royal Army crossed France from La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast to Montfer near the modern borders of Switzerland and Italy. Together with her, plague bacilli spread throughout the country. In a few years, according to the estimate given by the French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladry, the country has lost more than 1 million subjects. Epidemics use roads, bridges, ships, trains and planes that we create to speed up communications between cities, regions, countries or continents. Another deadly infection, cholera, is a good example. It has long been common in India. Although in the 6th century the Portuguese established their colonies there, the disease did not reach Europe for a long time. Only in the first half of the 6th century epidemics break out in Russia, France, England and even in America. It was probably the speed and intensity of communications. Cholera outbreaks fade quickly after a few weeks if the bacterium runs out of new victims. The ancient ships went very slowly and the infection was not able to survive the sea voyage. Faster ships built in the 6th century, and later the invention of steamboats and the opening of the Suez Canal which connected the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea, allowed her to travel with complete comfort. There is a price to pay for progress.